Tēnā koutou katoa. Nō mai ki te tiriti o te Waitangi motuhaki. Hello and welcome to the Treaty of Waitangi special. The Treaty of Waitangi is the founding document of Aotearoa New Zealand, and it was meant to be the unifying document between the Maori and the British Empire. However, between breaches of the treaty and differences in understanding, it has become a source of much conflict. Aotearoa first became colonized by the Maori around 1320 CE. They lived in relative isolation until European explorers and settlers started to arrive around 1769 CE. By the 1930s, New Zealand was considered an independent Maori-controlled territory and a frontier outpost for the British penal colony of New South Wales. As New Zealand trade continued to expand, a good working accord between Maori and European settlers was vital. However, violence did occur, and some European settlers asked Britain to intervene and maintain control. However, since British law didn't extend to New Zealand, they were reluctant to do so. Still, Europeans purchased vast areas of New Zealand, and in 1839, the London-based New Zealand Company prepared to purchase land on both sides of the Cook Strait, started sending its ships filled with hundreds of settlers. The British government relented and began to take action. They appointed Naval Captain William Hobson as both consul to an independent New Zealand and Lieutenant Governor to areas where Maori consented to become British. He was to negotiate sovereignty and to establish a permanent British colony. En route, he received advice from New South Wales Governor George Gibbs on drafting a treaty with the Maori. On 29th of January 1840, Hobson arrived at the Bay of Islands, and with help from his secretary, James Freeman, they began drafting notes for the new treaty. James Busby then tidied the notes up and added to them. The notes were then translated into te reo by missionaries Henry Williams and his son Edward. On the 5th of February, 500 Maori were invited to Waitangi and were presented with the te reo version of the treaty. A debate over land, trade, and chiefly authority ensued. By the end of the day, no agreement had been reached. The following day, on the 6th of February, after a short debate, 40 of the chiefs agreed to sign the treaty. In the following days, more signatures were added after meetings at Waimate and Hokianga. However, not all chiefs were eager to sign. Hobson, however, was quick to report back to Britain. He said he successfully secured British sovereignty within New Zealand. However, before more signatures could be collected, Hobson fell gravely ill. So it was left up to a couple of army officers and some missionaries to collect the remaining signatures. Soon over 500 chiefs had signed, most signing the Te Reo Treaty. However, 39 chiefs from Manukau Harbour and the Waikato Heads had signed the English versions, and on each copy, Europeans had signed as witnesses. Right from the start, there was issues with the treaty, including its poor translation into te reo, which has led to much controversy. Article 1 in te reo says that the chiefs give the Queen te kawanatanga katoa, or governance over the land. But in English, it says that the chiefs give the Queen all the rights and powers of sovereignty over the land. Article 2 in Te Reo confirms and guarantees the chiefs te tino rangatiritanga, or chieftainship, over the land, villages and tonga, and gave the Crown rights to deal with them over all land transactions. In English, it guaranteed and confirmed exclusive and undisturbed possessions of land, estate, forest, fisheries and other properties to the Maori chiefs, and gave the British Crown exclusive rights to deal with the Maori over land transactions. The third article stated the Crown's assurance that Maori would receive all the rights and protection afforded to British subjects. The translation on both the Te Reo and English versions was very close together on this one. Chiefs who signed weighed their considerations against the Maori text of the treaty. They wanted support in settlement regulations, in land sales. They wanted the trade opportunities and a chance to end intertribal warfare. They knew this meant sharing power, but they were assured by the Maori text of the treaty that their chieftain would be left in place. Some chiefs were never given the opportunity to sign. In such regions like Taranaki, Hawke's Bay and Wairarapa, where no or next to no meetings were held. In some cases, where the chiefs were absent from meetings, the negotiators impatiently left before the chiefs could arrive. Some chiefs, like as in Te Arawa and Ngāti Wharetoa, refused to sign because they didn't want their iwi's mana or independence placed under the British Crown. The great chief of Waikato, Te Whirowhiro, refused to sign for this very reason. Other regions that were embroiled in intertribal conflict, such as Te Reo of Thames or Te Puia of Tauranga, refused to sign so that they retained the ability to control their own affairs. The Crown considered that it now had enough signatures for a mandate to continue with its colonisation plans. This, however, would be challenged in the future. The Crown and the British officials considered only the English version of the treaty, which gave less of an emphasis on the rights of Maori chiefs than it did in the Maori text. And within 4 years, they admitted that the rights of the chiefs would need to be limited, as it conflicted with the Crown's authority. Despite not all chiefs signing, the British government insisted that all Maori be placed under British authority. Although the treaty was supposed to give protection to the Maori, this often conflicted with the actions of the British officials, and that led to violence in Wairoa and Northland. Other times, the treaty was simply ignored, like in the case where the New Zealand company's dubious purchase of Maori land to found the now capital, Wellington. Many Maori were concerned that the British would not uphold their obligations to the treaty, and these concerns were confirmed when the Protector of Maori Rights, appointed by the Governor, was caught acting as a negotiator for land purchases. Also, concerns that the Crown would try and seize uncultivated Maori land led the chief Te Whirowhiro to appeal to Queen Victoria for assurance that treaty guarantees would be honoured. As European settlements expanded and tensions grew, many tribes strengthened their tribal councils, and the Taranui Federation formed into an alliance. Their aims of tribal unity brought in other tribes from surrounding areas, and in 1858, the chief Te Whirowhiro was pronounced as the first Maori king. It was hoped that Te Kingitanga could withdraw from land sales and coexist with the British Crown. The attitude of the settlers was divided. Some, like William Martin, felt that the honour of the Crown rested on upholding the treaty. Others considered the treaty to be incompatible, and alongside British officials, considered the Maori king to be treasonable, and so conflict became inevitable. By 1860, fighting between the British and the Maori had started in Taranaki over a land dispute. Governor Brown called a conference of chiefs at Kohimarama. His goal? Gain Maori support for his actions in Taranaki and removal of Te Kingitanga. It was here where the chiefs learnt of the different understandings of the treaty. Nevertheless, they passed the Kohimarama Convent and recognised the Crown's sovereignty and chiefly authority. More meetings were meant to be held, but none were to follow. In 1861, Governor George Grey, convinced that Te Kingitangi movement challenged the Crown's authority, invaded Waikato, and as violence spread to the Bay of Plenty and elsewhere, officially this was called a fight against Maori rebels, but in reality this was a war for British supremacy. The war convinced many Maori of the government's disregard of the treaty, and with land being confiscated from Waikato, Taranaki and elsewhere, it left a bitterness which exists to this day. Despite the troubles, hundreds of settlers continued to arrive each year, and by 1870, Maori were outnumbered 10 to 1. These new settlers had no intention of following the treaty, and the Maori Land Court converted Maori-held land to Crown titles, making it easier to sell and to confiscate. The Public Works Act allowed the Crown to acquire more Maori land for road, rail and other public works, and by 1890, 2/3 of the North Island and most of the South Island was in British hands. The Maori held several conferences during the 1870s and debated the promises made to them in the treaty. In 1879 and in the 1880s, Ngāti Whātua chief Paurua Tuhiri held major gatherings at Waitangi Te Tai Marae to discuss ways to regain control of Maori affairs and to petition the government on treaty grievances, however, with no avail. So, in 1882, 84, 1914 and 1924, delegations of Maori travelled to England to petition the Crown to ensure treaty guarantees were being observed. However, the New Zealand government denied breaching the treaty, and the petitions went nowhere. In 1868, the first 4 Maori MPs were elected to Parliament. However, their Pākehā colleagues dashed any hopes of theirs to gain more Maori control. In 1892, the Maori formed Te Kotahitanga o Te Treaty of Waitangi, or the Union of the Treaty of Waitangi. It was hoped that this unified voice would support the Maori MPs in Parliament. However, it was largely ignored, and by the early 20th century, it became disbanded. However, the Kingitangi established Te Kohangi Anui in the 1880s, and it remains to this day. In 2008, Te Kohangi Anui signed an agreement with the government for co-management of the Waikato River. As the 20th century started, relations between the government and Maori improved, despite the continued sale of Maori land. A new generation of Maori arose, including MP Apirata Ngata, who helped develop schemes to cultivate Maori land, to consolidate holdings, and for the first time, Maori farming ventures received government funding. In the early 1920s, the government acknowledged and compensated Te Aroha Iwi and Ngā Te Tūwharitua over the loss of fishing and burial rights. And in 1943, the Ratana Church political movement formed an alliance with the Labour Party and won all 4 Maori seats in Parliament, and they pushed for the treaty to be recognised within law. And in 1932, the general public could no longer hide from the treaty, as the Governor-General, Lord Bledisloe, and his wife gifted to the nation James Busby's house and the surrounding area, the site where the treaty was first signed. And in 1934, 100 years after the flag of the United Tribes was selected to represent an independent Aotearoa, a grand hui was held at Te Tai Marae. In 1940, a centennial demonstration was planned to show unity and pride amongst the nation. However, many Maori were less than enthusiastic given the government's bad standings with treaty violations. Ngāti used this event to call on the government to settle treaty disputes, and under his supervision, a wharerunga was built at Waitangi, a symbol of 2 worlds standing together. Unfair treatment over land issues continue to plague Maori and government relations. In 1967, the Maori Affairs Amendment Act made the acquisition of undeveloped Maori land even easier. This led to the 1975 march from the far north to Wellington by Maori leader Dame Whina Cooper in protesting the loss of Maori land. Throughout the 70s and the 80s, protests at Waitangi became larger and more vocal, especially after 1974 when February 6 became a public holiday. In 1975, the government passed the Treaty of Waitangi Act and created the Waitangi Tribunal. Finally, treaty grievances can be heard. Although the tribunal had little power at first, its strength has grown, and through further amendments, it has more power to extend membership, to research and hold hearings. From the mid-1980s, several new acts of parliament have referenced the treaty and its principles. This legal recognition will have far-reaching consequences for both local and national government. Today, the treaty is still a debated topic, as historians, lawyers, and scholars all challenge the way that we view, interpret, and respect the treaty. And as successive governments work to uphold the values of the treaty, to reconcile the relationship between Maori and the Crown, it is up to us as Kiwis to ensure we move forward as a nation, that we acknowledge what has happened in the past, to correct our mistakes, and to ensure that they are never repeated. He aha te me nui o te ao. He tangata, he tangata, he tangata. Ka kite ao.